The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has once again resurged as a flashpoint in global politics. Good evening, I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and welcome to Unfiltered. What role should South Africa play in this delicate moment in international relations, and is our foreign policy appropriate for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Joining me to discuss these issues tonight are Zane Dangor, the Director General from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Africa for Peace Head Coordinator Klaas Mokgomole, and Usuf Chikte from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. On Zoom, we're also joined by Daniel Levy, President of the US Middle East Project, and a former Israel peace negotiator and advisor in the Israeli Prime Minister's office. But first, let's have a look at this insert produced by the Unfiltered team.
Waking up to sirens after what the Israelis called a surprise attack by the Gaza Strip. Both sides pointing fingers and blaming each other for the escalation of violence.
Targeting women and children, this terrible barbarism. This is not a legitimate entity. This is an entity that wants the destruction of Israel as the Jewish state. And Israel must do everything she possibly can to stamp out this terror, to prevent this kind of ongoing violence, and to ensure that her citizens are protected in every possible way.
The blame here lies in the hands of the Israeli occupation power. We know very well that Palestinians have been suffering under a brutal illegal military occupation for 70 plus years. There's been a systematic system of apartheid in the lands of Palestine for over 50 years. Gaza has been blockaded through the land, the air and the sea for over 16 years now.
However, the human cost of this conflict rises as many on both sides have lost their lives.
We are still seeing exchange of rockets throughout the night, throughout the morning, rockets being fired from Gaza, and then Israel replying with more retaliation. So it's still very much an active battlefield, a very chaotic battlefield.
The South African government has also condemned the attack.
The killing of innocent citizens has to be condemned. There is no basis for attacking civilians. There is no basis of attacking private individuals' properties. But the solution lies with the world that must actually unite and condemn how Israel has continued to, even just yesterday, go out and say they are going for a total destruction of Gaza. And until now, nobody is actually calling out President Netanyahu. Nobody is making any reference to the ICC. We definitely need consistency, and we need to see the abuse of human rights and the violation of other people's rights in a consistent manner.
So far, no South Africans have been reported dead or injured.
I am a South African Palestinian literature professor in Gaza right now with a wife and two small daughters. My flat was bombed by apartheid Israel. Israel has said that Gazans must leave. This is exactly what the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to say 2 days ago. But we all can't go anywhere because the border was bombed. Rafah is the only exit to the external world.
The question now is, where does the war leave innocent civilians?
Welcome back to Unfiltered. Mr. Dangor, could I begin by just getting your response to events in Israel and Palestine and its conflict that, of course, has risen to the surface of international politics once again since the 8th of October, when we saw the events of Hamas militants with an unprecedented incursion into Israeli territory, killing many innocent civilians in unprecedented numbers.
So I think the scale and the shock nature of the attack has caught everybody by surprise. I think what we have said is that irrespective of what the justifications are for armed action, our view is that the targeting of civilians can never be justified. We understand the impetus for armed resistance in the face of oppression, and international law does give you that leeway. It's justified under international law. But I think that targeting of civilians in any situation must be called out. At the same time, we see that the response by the Israeli government is significantly bad. I think you're targeting civilians is par for the course, actually, for the government of Israel. Many of us have actually stated that some kind of response is inevitable by the Palestinians, given just the events of the last 18 months or so. That you've always had right-wing governments, but this is possibly, and it's been described as the most right-wing government in history. And they've actually, many of the ministers, Minister Smotrich in particular, and others, have actually said that the intention is not a two-state solution. The intention is actually to annex as much land as possible. So we've seen an increased attack on civilians, an increased attack with the aid of the Israeli government by settlers in occupied territories. We've seen increased destruction of homes, increased approaches to collective punishment. What we're saying is that the response from the international community should be to call for de-escalation immediately. We should call for an end to all forms of conflict and fighting, and that negotiations and genuine negotiations towards ending the occupation must commence. Genuine negotiations.
Right.
Just one more thing. I think we should actually, nobody should be seeking to escalate or inflame the situation. And we're calling on the international community to work with many of us, including today the Arab League and others, that is calling for de-escalation and an end to the conflict.
Mr. Mokgomole, can I bring you in and ask for your reaction to South Africa's stance towards the events in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as it pertains to the current moment?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sizwe. I think we need to sort of establish a fact. Is that obviously, if you check, in 2005, Israel left Gaza. After Israel left Gaza in 2005, that's when we started having a number of conflicts coming from that area. And obviously, from this weekend, what we notice is that it has actually been proven that we're no longer dealing with sort of a political organization in the form of Hamas. We're dealing with a terrorist organization. A terrorist organization that celebrates killing babies. Over 40 babies were killed. A terrorist organization that enjoys recording when people are being beheaded, when people are being shot. A terrorist organization that goes into a musical concert of young people in Israel, in the south of Israel, in Sderot, and start shooting. You understand now, that sort of put us at a difficult position. But I feel like South African stance when it comes to the Middle East conflict has always been flawed and has never really been truthful, especially because South Africa has never been a role in terms of negotiations. I feel like South Africa could play a better role. For example, South Africa could have played a role of a mediator in this conflict. But what South Africa did was to choose sides. South African stance was always that we stand with the people of Palestine. And South Africa was always saying that, look, there's apartheid in the Middle East. Of course, we can always debate that. And we know for a fact that it's not apartheid in the Middle East. I feel like South Africa can play a better role by making sure that they bring all the parties together and negotiate. But because South Africa already withdrew itself from the table of negotiation, now we're faced with the problem because South Africa decided to choose a side when it comes to this conflict. And when you choose a side in a conflict, now your views are going to be clouded and we can't really take them into heart.
Right. Let me bring in some of our other panelists as our debate and discussion unfolds. Mr. Levy, could I bring you in? Of course, you bring an international perspective, also a perspective having worked in Israel as an advisor to a former prime minister. What is your response to the conversation so far, and particularly how you're looking at the recent events in the most recent escalation of this conflict?
Sizwe, let me thank you for allowing me to join your conversation this evening. I've heard the conversation so far. I don't think anyone could look at what happened on the weekend in Israel in terms of the attack by the militants and not think that once humanity was offended and this was an unconscionable act. And I've heard both the speakers say that. But I equally don't see how anyone can look at the situation in Gaza, look at the Israeli commitment to stopping electricity, food, water, humanitarian assistance, to the indiscriminate bombing campaign that Israel is conducting in Gaza, and these civilian casualties which are inevitable. One cannot pretend that this is an unfortunate, unpredictable Hamas's full outcome. No, Israel is dropping those bombs. So I think both of these things are unconscionable, immoral, dehumanizing, and actually a violation of international law. But surely we're also capable of holding a third thought at the same time, which is that we mustn't lose sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture does not excuse either of the acts that we've just talked about and described. But the bigger picture is that there is an occupying power and an occupied people, and that occupied people is denied their most basic rights and freedoms. And I, from the inside, tried to make the argument in Israel that this would be bad for Israeli security. I've tried to warn the international community at the UN Security Council and elsewhere that Israel will not have peace and security if Palestinians do not have that. So this isn't a question. I heard one of your guests talk about choosing sides. One cannot sit on the sidelines and pretend that these are two equal parties. These are not. And I heard Mr. Dangor talk about the need for de-escalation, and I would endorse that. I think you're not helping Israel if, whether you're America or others in the West, if you're encouraging Israel to make the situation even worse, to create even more Palestinian suffering. We need responsible adults from the international community to bring a fire extinguisher, not to bring a gas canister. And I hope that we can expand and talk about that, because the last thing I will say at the moment, if I may, is that the language we are hearing coming out at the moment is deeply disturbing, the dehumanizing. And this can take us to a terrible place. War is a terrible place to be. And we have to step back, look at the root causes of this conflict, look at the fact of Palestinian dispossession. Your guest mentioned 2005, but why is Gaza full of refugees? Most people, these Palestinian citizens who live in Gaza, are refugees from when Israel removed Palestinian civilians in an act of ethnic cleansing in 1947 to 49. And that is why, when we look at this situation, if Palestinians are going to live under the indignity of, when the designation of apartheid is made by Palestinian groups, by Israeli human rights groups, by the international human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, they are not drawing a one-to-one parallel to the history of your own country. This is a crime under international law, and they are saying the designation of that crime has been met. And that can never be a recipe for peace,
right,
whether for Israelis or Palestinians.
Indeed. Let's bring in Mr. Chikte to intervene in the debate. You've heard three different perspectives. What's your view both on the most recent violence that of course has surged to the forefront of global headlines, but also your reflection on the conversation thus far?
Given what has happened in 10 hours that shook the world and shook the colony of the settler colony of Israel, I've got one sentence on that. The choice faced by the Palestinians from the liberatory fighters was an ineluctable option. They had no choice but to resist. And they tried almost every kind and almost every other kind of negotiations, collaboration through the PA and secession of territories. And despite all that, since 1948, they've been subject to a cruel system of ethnic cleansing transformed into apartheid, settler colonialism, and a vicious form of Zionism. What do people do? We certainly don't revel in the glorification of violence. But it reminded me when I was 6 years old, in the 1960s in South Africa, when we were in our darkest period, when the lights went out of South Africa, and POCO, the armed resistant wing of one of the liberatory movements, struck fear into the hearts of those who were in power in South Africa. It made us ask lots of questions, but it didn't make us deviate from the purpose of overthrowing a racist apartheid regime, of dismantling it. And we could balance, and it was a difficult choice between that and our liberation. So when you speak about the killing of civilians, the Palestinian liberatory organizations have a different view. They are people who are occupied under a colonial form of despotism. And what they are doing is they are distinguishing between soldiers, armed settlers who persecute them, who go about pogroms, and civilians. And they've issued, and it is not well reported, that they have provided people with the assurance that this is their conduct of war. And there was one person who spoke about the killings of babies, one of the first casualties in this war, ongoing war, the endless war that apartheid Israel is conducting against a stateless, defenseless population, is truth. He mentioned the issue of 40 babies being killed, beheaded, they say. Biden has retracted from that. The IDF has retracted from that. This is part and parcel of a colonial propaganda machine which tries to portray a savage African, a savage colonized people. It's a form of Orientalism, this luscious, angry, murderous person, native, who goes about hunting the saviors of civilization,
right,
coming to green the land over here and save the people, and providing, as one of the British administrators in the 1930s said, will be a loyal Ulster in the sea of savage Arabism. It's the same thing that Churchill did.
Let me bring in my other panelists, Mr. Chikte, but we have heard your perspective against the other perspectives of the panelists this evening, and we have a long show ahead, so we will bring you back in. But Mr. Dangor, could I ask you, just before we go to the break, of course, feel free to respond to anything that's been said, but in practical terms, what kind of actions is the South African government taking at this time as it pursues its policy that you outlined earlier?
Look, I think what we're saying is we're willing to negotiate and be part of any mediation. We engaged with different Palestinian players, and we obviously, our formal interlocutors is the Palestinian Authority, but we also engage with other actors in the region, including Israeli NGOs, Israeli civil society, Palestinian civil society. So we're engaging with all of them. And there's generally, from Israeli NGOs like B'Tselem, Yesh Din, others calling for peace. And in fact, Yesh Din and B'Tselem are the ones who actually led the idea that Israel is an apartheid state. And Israeli lawyers So it's not just an empty accusation. It's just like occupation is not an accusation, it's a statement of fact. The ICJ has confirmed that. So we're basically saying that in our view at this time, the UN must come to the fore, because the kinds of negotiations that have taken place in the last, Daniel could assist us there as a negotiator has not worked. We need the international community to be center. The kind of power players like the US and others have not been successful in actually bringing all the parties to negotiate in a way that will actually end the occupation. And remember, this is not a symmetrical struggle, it's very asymmetrical. You've got, as Daniel has pointed out, an occupying power, and an occupying power cannot declare war on the people that they occupy. That's just international law, fact number one. They've got a duty to actually look after the people that they are occupying. And we're talking about Gaza being the largest open-air prison globally, and that's, again, not just a claim, it's a statement of fact.
Right.
If it's the most densely populated, one of the most densely populated areas globally, and to have the kind of bombing that you have there and saying that you are not targeting civilians is basically a lie.
Right.
And so I think we just want to
leave it there before we go to our break. We're going to go to a break and we'll come back to all of our panelists. We're discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which of course has risen to the forefront of global political attention. We'll be back after the break to look at some of the wider global ramifications of this particular moment and of course South Africa's place in those consequences. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has, of course, risen to the forefront of global attention following recent events. Mr. Mokgomole, can I come back to you? Because, of course, as we step away from the immediate situation, there are wider questions of debate and discussion. And one of those was the appropriateness of the term apartheid as it applies to this situation. Yeah. You suggested that that term was inappropriate. What is your view on the appropriateness of that analogy?
Look, I want to sort of use this as a point of departure. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And by the way, it's a liberal democracy. When you look at Israel and you look at the constitution, it allows for people to start a political party. Arabs can start a political party, Jews can start a political party. There's no discrimination when it comes to Israel. Obviously, Arabs and Jews can share schools, can share hospitals, can share public areas. The number of things that we can get into when it comes to Israel. When it comes to elections, anyone can vote. So we take that and compare it to South African apartheid system. Obviously, we didn't have that in South Africa. We couldn't have black people voting. Black people were banned from a number of things, from gathering, from running political parties and stuff like that. I think one of the things that obviously I want to sort of get into is obviously what the other panelists spoke about, issue of the occupier. Israel became powerful because of the area. By the way, Israel, if you check the map of Israel, there's Egypt, there's Lebanon, there's Syria, there's Iran, there's Saudi, stuff like that. So they were forced to sort of be powerful. They were not they didn't become powerful from 1948, they were forced because of the attack that they received. And I think now when you look at the recent attacks from Gaza, and then I think one of the questions that we need to sort of address is maybe the proportionality, understand the proportionality of fighting terrorism. Because Israel faces terrorism every time, from Gaza, from the West Bank. So there's a lot of terrorism that is taking place, and I don't think our panelists are sort of addressing that. And I feel like when you're dealing with a terrorist, you cannot address a terrorist like you're addressing any other member of a political organization, because terrorists don't think about that. That's why you look at it now where people that are kidnapped. In the war, we don't see that. Innocent civilians were kidnapped. Understand? So when you talk about use of force again, which as a public international law scholar, I can sort of address it, I can get into it, I can dwell into it. Another thing that you can look at it is the negotiations. Let's go back to the Oslo Accords.
Well, let's stop there because we will come to the deeper history. But I want to focus on this question of the apartheid analogy because I think particularly in South Africa, as we reflect from this perspective on this question, we have something to say, certainly an interesting debate to have given our experience. Mr. Levy, what do you make of the analogy? Of course, you've already alluded to the fact that various international NGOs and even some within Israel have made that analogy, but others actually from a South African perspective sometimes say in a way that trivializes the experiences of South African apartheid in one way, and in other ways doesn't show the egregiousness of some of the violence that we see in other ways, and therefore kind of from both perspectives the analogy can be inapt. Do you think it's apt or inapt?
Well, thank you very much for asking me that question with the panel of South Africans. First of all, I would say that the Israel that was just described is not one I recognize as someone who lived there and has the citizenship and served in the military and worked in the government there. I wish it were the place that was just described to us. Israel, and I just want to address one of those things, and then I won't dodge your question, I promise.
Sure. We're having a discussion and a debate, so feel free to intervene.
Thanks. Look, I totally endorse the idea that Israel has to be in a position to defend itself. Israel has achieved peace agreements with its neighbors with whom it has been at war in the past. I don't think, by the way, that ability to be powerful enough to defend itself should have included becoming a nuclear power and not being a signatory to the NPT, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I don't think it can include, even when acting in self-defense, violating the rules of war. But I also think, and this is what seems to be totally lost in that analysis, is what happens to your own society when you run a system of oppression, of occupying another people, and to address the use of that word. What has been designated by the organizations who have made the apartheid legal designation is not that a one-to-one symmetry exists between your history, and others will be better placed to speak to that. Not that a one-to-one symmetry exists between what were the elements of petty apartheid, what were the elements of grand apartheid. No, that there is a crime under international law, which is the crime of apartheid. And that is the crime being committed against Palestinians in terms of the structure of the system, the structural discrimination, where people can live. The Palestinians in the occupied territories face a particular kind of structural discrimination, where they can move to, where they can live, how their land is taken, which court system. They can't vote in the elections of the country that controls their lives. They voted for a Palestinian Authority, which has essentially been co-opted over the 30 years when all avenues politically were blocked to the Palestinians. Part of that was the co-opting of an authority created for limited self-governance. If people can draw parallels to your history, perhaps they will, in terms of what has unfortunately happened there. Inside Israel, it's a different system. People can vote, but the structural discrimination of land control and in many other respects, who can live in which communities, still exists there.
Right. Let me stop you there. I will bring you back in. But Mr. Chikte, can I get your perspective on this, because we've heard two different views on whether this term is the appropriate and apt one. What's your view on that?
Thank you. The definition in terms of the Apartheid Convention is apartheid is defined as a systematic oppression of one group over another. Israel defines itself as a nation state for Jews and Jews alone. Self-determination for Palestinians and liberty for Palestinians does not exist. Of course, South Africa in the 1936, the Africans could vote in the Cape Parliament. Those misclassified colored could vote in the Senate up till the 1950s. segregation before 1948 turned into apartheid, fully fledged apartheid. There is no doubt from all groups in terms of land relations, in, protection of individual liberty, the franchise, the balkanization of the Palestinian people, that South Africa fits, that Israel fits the definition of apartheid. Even Verwoerd said that in the 1960s, that Israel is an apartheid state like South Africa. So, and the whole question of a democracy, you cannot have a nation state for Jews and Jews alone, and then have a right of return for a person from anywhere over the world by some dubious classification of being of self-identifying yourself Jew, and then denying those who were born and stayed in Palestine for thousands of years, not giving them the same political, civic, and every other kind of right. And so the whole idea that the notion that there are terrorists amongst the Palestinians, it's the inverse of that. Israel has established itself through a reign of state terror. Its settler colonialists conduct daily acts of terror and pogroms, and that is all over the place. So how on earth, and the whole imagery and the actions and the classification of colonizer and colonized is being turned around. The person somebody mentioned about kidnapped, that the Palestinians kidnap people. It's exactly the opposite. The Israelis are having in jail through all kinds of laws thousands of prisoners, but not even prisoners, detainees, persons who are in detention without trial, and they use them illegally as a form of negotiations. But besides that, and this is a very important point.
And let's round off your intervention
Israel
here.
holds the bodies of 600, more than 600 killed Palestinians whom they've killed, who've died in their hands. And they refuse to release those bodies. And this is a deprivation of liberty beyond life. How cruel can you get?
I just want to leave it there, Mr. Chikte, because I just want to focus on this question of the apartheid analogy. So I just want to bring in our other panelists as well. And Mr. Dangor, from a South African government perspective, do we stand by the aptness of that analogy? And if so, why do you believe that it is the wise thing to say from a governmental perspective?
So we've engaged with Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, like I said, Yeshtin Bet-Salem, Advocate Michael Sfard from the University in Tel Aviv, and we've also met with the Palestinian NGOs like Adama and others who've written about this for many, many years and actually done the analysis in terms of how the actions, including the nation-state law and many other laws, and especially the Amnesty report is very detailed from an international legal perspective on how the laws and practices actually contravene the Convention Against Apartheid. In fact, the Amnesty launch in Africa was done in South Africa. And these are people who actually have studied this, they've done the research, so so it's not just opinion, it's fact. And the analysis is sound. And based on that, I think we've embraced what they are saying, and we think that it's an apt analogy. And as Daniel's saying, it's not a direct comparison between apartheid and South Africa. It's really using the international framework, which grew out of occupation, occupation in Namibia. So the laws of occupation, a lot of it is based on the occupation by apartheid South Africa on Namibia, but also the apartheid in South Africa. So we do believe that, based on the research and analysis, that it is accurate, and that is something that the international community must take seriously.
Right.
Because breaches of that is an international wrongful act, and international wrongful acts must be dealt with and countered by the international community.
Let me bring in Mr. Mokgomole, because you have an alternative perspective on this, and just to offer you the opportunity to respond. I know you disagreed with a lot of what was said. Before we go to break, can you offer your responses.
I think our panelists, what they're doing is sort of speak about Israel in conjunction of everything that is happening. For example, Israel is only in charge of what's happening in Israel. Israel is not in charge of what's happening in Gaza. Hamas is in charge of what's happening in Gaza. I think one of the things that our panelists need to sort of account is actually to answer the question of when last did we have elections in Gaza, if we're going to call Gaza a democracy. And when you look at Gaza and what's happening in Gaza, the human rights violations that are actually sort of perpetuated by Hamas, you can't really blame Israel for those things. Then you move to the West Bank, where we have the PA, Palestinian Authority, that is in charge of that area. And we check when last we have elections that are sort of democratic. Understand? So now, and another thing that we need to look at is the definition of apartheid. Because now you can't say, no, we're not using the original definition of apartheid. When we talk about apartheid, we have to look at sort of the primary case or primary source. Primary source of apartheid is South Africa. We need to go back to the acts of parliament that were passed in South Africa and what they did in South Africa. And we go to Israel and look at what's happening in Israel, and we sort of have to draw that analysis from there.
Right.
And again, you can't really blame Israel for being, just last point, for being a state.
We'll bring you back in, don't worry, we're only halfway through.
Okay.
So we have much more to discuss and debate, and I know that other panelists disagree with you, so we'll bring them back in as well. But we are discussing, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Of course, this is a complex question, and it's risen to the forefront of global and world political debate given recent events and recent escalations of violence. We'll be back to delve into wider issues that surround and pervade this question. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. Levy, could I come to you at the beginning of this segment? I just want to reflect on a more global perspective quickly and ask what you make of global responses, firstly to Hamas's militant incursion into Palestinian territory, and why you think Hamas acted now, and whether you think that represents a shift in global sentiment, which may be belied by coverage in global media to some extent, but whether that reflects a shift in global sentiment, and whether you think that Hamas, quite aside from whether one condones, and I think 99%, and speaking for myself, most observers don't condone the horrific violence that we saw. But whether you think this moment represents some kind of shift in global perspectives towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, it's a very interesting question, Sizwe, and I think what we have seen in the Western responses, political responses, and the media coverage is to swing very strongly behind Israel. Even at the expense of forgetting or perhaps willfully ignoring the existence of international law. And I think this is not great, to put it mildly, for the US and for those Western powers when they have really been trying to wag their fingers at the rest of the world in the last year and a half over the Ukraine crisis, saying, where are you, rules-based order, international law? And then much of the rest of the world, I'm not in love with the term global south, but much of the global majority had turned around and said, well, where are you most of the time? You selectively apply this. And I think this really brings to the fore that selective application, because as you said, Sizwe, I think global sentiment is acknowledging the reality of a deeply discriminatory regime. There's a reason that Archbishop Desmond Tutu said when he visited, said this was worse than the situation that he had lived through back home. And of course, Mandela spoke about the Palestine situation very much. So I think global sentiment is shifting. Why Hamas acted in terms of was that what gave the push? I think it may have been part of it, but I think Hamas was also acting precisely because Gaza is not free. The idea that they are in charge of Gaza is belied by the fact that they are blockaded. The civilian population of Gaza has been under a siege for 16 years. They cannot exit and enter. They can't use their access to the water, to the air. Everything that comes in is measured and decided by Israel. So this is not under international law, Israel is still the occupying power. But, and this is very important, it's not just the situation in Gaza, of course. It's that what you have is that Palestinians in the peace process, the Palestinian negotiating party thought it was buying into a deal whereby Israel would withdraw its occupation and there could be some kind of Palestinian sovereignty. And the party that opposed Hamas has lost its credibility amongst Palestinians because none of that happened. Israel increased its illegal settlements, entrenched its occupation, entrenched the very paradigm of partition, which I think has been used to dispossess Palestinians. And what this has done for Israel, and this is really a point I want to drive home, I think this has been a terrible lesson for Israel because it has led Israel to think that the Palestinians can be treated with dismissiveness, can be treated with contempt, can be left in those conditions. The international community led by America, the West, treats Israel with impunity, and therefore the Israelis have become lazy in their thinking about the Palestinian situation. And that leads to complacency and to hubris and the kind of decomposition within the system which produced the huge intelligence, deterrence, and military strategic failure on the weekend. And so what I'm saying to you is, actually, this is bad for Israelis as well as Palestinians.
Mr. Chikte, just in terms of the wider global perspective on this question, it might be argued that Hamas's actions have in many ways been counterproductive by, in some ways, alienating those who may support the Palestinian cause but who cannot condone Hamas's acts of violence. And we've therefore seen a rebound effect of that violence, which has actually been harmful for the overall Palestinian cause. What is your view of the way that Hamas's actions have reverberated around the world?
Firstly, Palestine, the Palestinians have never enjoyed the support of the European Union, of the United States of America, and its allies. And there's a big difference in terms of the support from these colonial governments, former colonial governments, some, and the populations across the world. So much so, it's obvious that the European Union and the United States are concerned that the chief policeman in the area, the outsourced military garrison in the area is under threat. And so with all the tin pot dictators, the so-called kings and generals and everybody else around there, that's why they brought in the Sixth Fleet, not the Sixth Fleet, the USS Carrier, to ensure that remains. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there's a big difference between the support of the political regimes and the political establishment and the peoples of the world. Right across in South Africa, in Africa, in Europe, in the UK, and the United States, there have been massive demonstrations of support. There is a decline in the support for Israel amongst young Jewish persons in the States as well. And so much so that in the United States, in Europe, and in Germany and the UK, they must introduce special legislation to ban flags, to ban slogans, and they must retreat from freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. Such is the nature of support for the Palestinians. And I think that's a very important point.
Indeed. Let me just bring in our other panelists. We will come back, Mr. Chikte. But Mr. Mokgomole, your view on the wider question of how this is being understood and interpreted in different parts of the world. Israel, of course, would say countries like India, who once were very vehemently opposed to Israeli actions, have become more allied to Israel. It has generated closer relationships with some of its neighbors over the last 5 or so years, and that, in fact, the global position is maybe favorable to Israel at this moment. What do you think on that?
I think obviously that's the case. Israel has been asking for peace ever since, I don't know since when, but since back in the days. So I wanted to speak about the Oslo Accords recently, that Israel was willing, and obviously the actions of Israel show that they are willing to sort of accept anything that is offered on the table. Spoke about two-state solution, spoke about a number of things, withdrawing from Gaza, number of things. But obviously you need to check what happens when Israel sort of withdraws. When they withdraw from Gaza, we saw rockets coming in. Whenever they sort of disengage from maybe the West Bank, we see a lot of suicide bombings, you understand? So I think the international community, whenever we deal with this issue, we always have to look at what's happening in Israel, and whether, because I also want to attend to the point that young people in Israel are sort of losing interest or sort of losing support of the government. I don't think that has to do with the current state or the current conflict. It has everything to do with the judicial reform that Netanyahu was talking about, was implementing. So it's nothing to do with this. So let's not sort of mix it. And I think there's a thing that we sort of see out there where people sort of jinx things, jinx information, and information that is shared in the media, information that is shared by political leaders is sort of misleading to our people. And I think that's not the way we should sort of deal with this topic.
Right. Mr. Dangor, I'm interested in your perspective. To what extent do you think that there is a global shift towards or against Israel, or indeed Palestine, or maybe we can say Gaza and the West Bank? On the one hand, you've seen our BRICS partner, India, of course, under the Modi government, coming out quite strongly in support of Israel, which is a change in the politics of the global South. But various other governments have also condemned Hamas and condemned Israel in recent days.
Sure, I think that the global forces for me is not as important as the fact that the global South has remained consistent, really, in calling out the actions of Israel over the last couple of days, including the Arab League, even though you may have found the issues around normalization being on the agenda for the last year or so. Even those countries that have been sort of talking about normalization have, as part of the Arab League, called for de-escalation, but also called for the respect for international law. And that's a major shift, because there has been impunity. Just recently at the G20 summit in India, there was a call from all of the leaders for the fair and even implementation of international law. It's very specific language that was used there, is that we all recall the prohibition of the use of force to annex land. And in our negotiations, Brazil and South Africa, we're very clear that when we talk about that, we talk about Ukraine and Russia, yes, but we also talk about Palestine. And India agreed to that. And every single G20 country, including the US and the EU, have agreed to that.
And at the time we were accused of whataboutery, but we have seen how these questions are.
So for us, for example, we called out the fact that the Russia's use of force was unlawful. We don't see that being said about the unlawful nature by those who support the Israeli actions. We don't see a single word of sympathy to the deaths of thousands of Palestinians. Those of us even on the panel have said we've expressed sympathy with Israeli deaths, because we have to. That's the humanity in us. But we haven't seen a single word of sympathy from the US and others about the deaths of Israelis, of the Palestinians. And it's thousands. Over 140,000 are displaced. houses demolished. So for me, the issue is impunity. Impunity, not now, but impunity over the last 50 years. Consistent breaches of international law has taken place, which has, as Daniel pointed out, created this sense of hubris amongst Israelis that they can do much as they please with very little repercussions from the international community. And I think this is when you contextualize this horrific violence. We don't justify it, but you contextualize it. That you have a people that have been oppressed for over 50 years. More if you'd go back to 48, right? And the history is very interesting. I mean, the Nakba, the forced expulsion of people from land, the fact that exiles cannot return, the right of return is not applied to Palestinians, and generations of Palestinians living in refugee camps in Lebanon and elsewhere. So that issue of impunity must be dealt with. And our message to the international community is that the uneven application of international law weakens the international system because it gives rise to impunity in other spaces.
Mr. Mokgomole, can I come to you? Unfortunately, we just have a few minutes to close off the show, but can we talk about the way forward here and what do you think can be done to rescue and reverse a situation which is becoming increasingly dire from whichever perspective one looks at it?
Recently I was in Bethlehem, at the Bethlehem Peace Center, when we spoke about this. And most of the people in the West Bank, and obviously and young people in Israel, whether it's Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, they all agree on one thing. We need leaders that are willing to compromise, not leaders that are going to take ammunition and going to kill innocent people. Leaders that are going to agree to sit on a table and negotiate. And leaders that are going to actually come forward and recognize each other. Number one, recognize Israel as a state. Because recently we haven't seen that from the Hamas side. They do not recognize Israel as a state. What they want to do is sort of diminish or demolish actually the state of Israel. So I feel like that's the thing that we need to sort of promote as an international community. Bring all the parties together. They will decide. And I remember someone saying, is one state or two states going to work? I feel like everyone on the table is going to decide on what's going to work for them. The same way we decided in South Africa on what's going to work for us during the first and the second coalition negotiations.
Mr. Chikte, I'm afraid we have a very short time, as I say, but your views on the way forward and what should be done.
Well, South Africa must take steps to expel the Israeli ambassador because he's peddling apartheid here. We mustn't appease Israel like Chamberlain appeased fascism in Germany in the 1930s. We must immediately open up an emergency corridor and stop the Israeli aggression, stop the war by Israel. We must stop the recruitment of South African soldiers in contravention of the Foreign Military Assistance Act. And we must bring Israel to account at the ICC and reactivate mechanisms at the United Nations, which will hold Israel accountable and impose sanctions on them. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Levy, we close with you tonight. Your thoughts on where to from here?
That's kind of you. Well, I think if you justify what happened, you've lost your humanity. But if you fail to contextualize what happened, as Mr. Dangor just told us, then you've lost your integrity, but also your ability to do strategy and policy. And the context is what was described to us. That impunity, that lack of accountability. Because what I can tell you is we need now to move to an immediate ceasefire, stop the warmongering. This will spread if we don't, because of the conditions Palestinians live under, not just in Gaza, in the West Bank, inside Israel. It could bring in surrounding countries. So we need to get to a ceasefire, and then we need to go back and address the root causes of Palestinian dispossession. And I can just share with you, I was an Israeli negotiator. I know the positions that were put forward. I don't often say this, but if I were a Palestinian, I would not have accepted what was on the table, because this was not a deal that could have brought dignity and a hope for the future to Palestinians. And next time around, for that to be different, we probably need a different mix of external actors. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all my panelists for an interesting discussion and debate from many different perspectives. Thank you for joining us again on Unfiltered, and ensure that you join us for future installments of Unfiltered Views, Unfiltered News, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.